You're listening to the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse at bellydancegeek.com.
Okay, hello everybody. This is Nadira Jamal, and welcome to the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse. The Clubhouse is a place where we can get geeky about all that's hard to get in classes and DVDs. I think it's really easy to find help with the what, the material, the things like movements and combinations. But it's really hard to get help with the why and the how. So things like dance composition, stage presence, professionalism, the music, the culture, the history, all that stuff is actually surprisingly hard to get. So here on the Clubhouse, I'm going to interview a different guest expert every month on a different topic. And every month we're also going to have time for you to ask the expert your questions so you can geek out too. So if you think that knowledge and creativity go together like chocolate and peanut butter, you're in the right place. So my guest today is Amy Smith. Amy has studied, taught, and performed Middle Eastern dance since 1994. And 15 years ago, she launched Middle Eastern Dance of New England, a successful bi-monthly magazine for the Middle Eastern dance community in New England, as well as a companion website. The magazine now is published online only as Belly Dance New England. Amy has always been fascinated by the history of Middle Eastern dance and music in Boston and in New England. And she's collaborating with photographer Michael Baxter to photograph the legends of Boston belly dance, and is also working on a documentary about the famous nightclub era from the 1950s to 80s of Boston belly dance. She's currently a member of Origins Folkloric Dance Company. So today, Amy's going to talk to us about the early days of belly dance in Boston. And before we start, I just want to give a little hat tip to Pamela Rosengren, who sparked this topic. And Pamela actually asked about the origins of the American Cabaret style. And we're not really going to answer her question directly since AMCAB didn't really have any single origin. But because Boston was home to very large Middle Eastern diaspora communities, it was one of the earliest hotbeds. So we're not going to cover the whole origins of the style, but we are going to give you a little bit of an insight into the melting pot culture that really fed the early development of belly dance in the United States. So let's jump right in. So thank you so much for coming, Amy.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm so glad. So to get us started, can you tell us a little about how you started researching the history of belly dance in the Boston area?
Sure. Well, I started actually because I was really interested because I actually trained with people from that era, or who were trained by people in that era. So I would hear a lot of stories about how it was back then. I was also really lucky to become friendly with a dancer who loves our musical heritage and knows so much about it, and I learned a lot from her about our musical legacy here in Boston. And then because of the legends of this legendary history, I wanted to pay tribute to them, to the legends, when my publication has 10th anniversary, and that's when I started collaborating with Michael.
Excellent. And if anybody here doesn't know Michael Baxter, you need to fix that right away because this photographer is a genius. I've gotten my best pictures from him, I think. So, Amy, when we talk about the early days, what time period are we talking about?
Definitely the 50s, and I would say even up through the 80s. And I use that those decades because that's when you could go to a club and see a great show with live music.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that specifically in Boston, you could see a dance show with music and dancers pretty much any night of the week up until the 80s. Yeah. Is that right? That's
true. Like it was in the heyday, it was 7 nights a week. Dancers told me that they would do their shows, and then if they weren't sitting in with the band, they would get up and leave and go into another club and catch a friend's show.
Nice.
I know, it sounds amazing.
Yeah. So, back especially in the earliest days in the 1950s, can you tell us about some of the different ethnic communities who were making their homes in Boston at the time?
Sure, and actually they probably predated that, but it was primarily the Armenians and the Greeks and the Lebanese. Mm-hmm. And you had the Greeks who settled mostly in the Lowell area. You had Armenians who kind of settled mostly around Watertown, Mass. And this used to actually be the largest population of Armenians. Now California can claim that honor.
Fresno.
Fresno and LA, actually, too.
Oh, really?
Yes. But an Armenian musician told me that the LA population tends to be Armenians of more Russian descent. The Armenian population here in New England tends to be more Turkish. You know, you have parts of Armenia that were annexed by Turkey. And I want to make the distinction only because of the musical repertoire, the effect it had on our musical repertoire. You know, of course, the Armenians know a lot of Turkish music, and that's what really affected or contributed to our repertoire here.
That was something that was actually really interesting to me when I learned about it, that, you know, because the Ottoman Empire was so vast in scope, for hundreds of years you had people who were ethnically and linguistically Armenian or Greek or from other ethnicities living in completely different parts of the Middle East. So you'd have, you know, Greeks who had been living in Turkey for 300 years and Armenians who had been living in Turkey for 300 years and vice versa. And so there was this tremendous cultural kind of cross-pollination. So you would have someone who identified as Armenian and spoke Armenian at home, but would also speak Turkish fluently and be immersed in this kind of Turkish culture and Turkish music, which makes wonderful music and wonderful development of the arts.
Exactly, and it's very interesting, you know, and I know, well, maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but in it's a generational thing where people of a certain generation are very comfortable with that kind of cognitive dissonance, if you will. You know, you'll have Armenian people who, like I said, come from a certain part of Armenia but have all this Turkish influence. But the younger generation, especially the generation that was born here, see this as a political issue. We'll talk about the Kef zone in a little bit, but I had one older Armenian gentleman tell me that the younger people don't like the music that they hear at the Kef because a lot of it's influenced by Turkey. They just want to hear Armenian music, pure Armenian music. So it's very interesting. You know, it's very interesting to hear that. And like I said, with the older generation, they're very comfortable with knowing Turkish and being familiar with Turkish music and playing Turkish music.
Most likely because they and their parents have that cultural connection to Turkey, yeah?
Exactly.
Exactly. So, and those communities had actually been in the Boston area for at least a generation by the time we're talking about the early days of the nightclub scene in the 50s. Am I right?
Definitely.
It predates the whole World War II thing.
Yes, I think the diaspora is. I should double check my dates, but I think a lot of Armenians came to the country in the diaspora, like between 1900 and 1920. Mm-hmm. The majority of them came over.
Right, and you obviously have the sad things happening in Armenia at that time, but also the breakup of the Ottoman Empire around that time too. So, you know, wars are a big time for cross-pollination. I mean, that's when my family came to the U.S. was after World War II. And so, you know, that's when people are very mobile, which is, you know, a sad thing for people, but a really happy thing for the arts because that's when you get this tremendous crossover.
Exactly. And there's opportunity. It's in the land of opportunity, right? So they come here to try their fortunes.
Mm-hmm. So we've got these three big groups, right? We've got the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Lebanese folks. And, you know, when they came to Boston, did they interact with each other very much?
Yeah, that's the premise of our research. Is we believe that the whole scene here in the Boston area was because they did that. They have a lot in common culturally. A lot of the food is similar. The basis of the music is similar. Some traditions are similar. So they did come together and to learn and to play each other's music. You know, it was like, you know, you'd have the Greek guys coming off the boat, and they would come to like clubs, right? So they could hear the music that they knew, and dance the dances that they knew, and have their food, you know.
Nice. So tell me about the early nightclub scene in Boston.
Oh, I was born in the wrong time. It's said, and this is one of the things we're trying to track down. When I say we, by the way, I do want to give a shout out to, I have a producer named Deanna Putnam, and she is sort of like, she's a journalist by trade, and she's like my silent partner. And I just want to acknowledge her because she's like a supporter in all this. But so the clubs were, let's see, I have my list here. We had things like clubs like the TikTok Lounge at Club Zahra. the El Morocco. It's said that Club Zahra was the first Middle Eastern club in the country to have live entertainment. And actually, Deanna pulled that up from somewhere. So, and I should point out here too that when I talk about things like these or like factoids like these, you know, Deanna's and my approach is a journalistic approach. Our research is not academic. In that we go to a lot of like libraries and stuff like that. We talk to people and we research archives and things like that. So I just want to put that out there. So, but yeah, so as far as our research indicates that the Club Zahra might have been one of the first to have live entertainment, belly dance music. And
what year was that? Do you know?
The early 50s, as far back as 1950, 52.
Excellent. And if it knows of something more recent than that, drop me a line or Amy, excuse me, not more recent, older than that. Drop me or Amy a line because I'm sure she'd love to have that for her research. But we had Club Zahra. Please tell me more.
Yeah, yes, and we had the El Morocco, which was named for, actually founded by a dancer named Morocco. Now, this was not the Morocco of New York City. This was a Lebanese dancer who's still alive. Unfortunately, she doesn't want to talk about those days. Try as I might, but she was a very well-known dancer back in those days, and she had a club named the El Morocco. There was the Palmyra, there was the Continental, and Club Khayyam. And these were clubs, but these were not small clubs. These were big. You had like banks of tables. These were supper clubs, and there was a stage. And that could hold a lot of people. It wasn't unknown to have 7 or 8 musicians at a time playing. Yeah.
Now, I'm actually going to jump in on there. So you said supper club specifically, and I think that nightclub means something different to people of my generation. I was born in the 80s, and for me, a nightclub is a place where people go out and get drunk and pick up somebody to go home with. You know, plus like the strobe lights and the dancing and the sweating and stuff like that. And this was a completely different thing, wasn't it?
It was. And I don't know about you, but I remember, like, and I'm older than you, but I remember my parents would go out every Saturday night. We'd get they'd bring a babysitter in, and they would go out, and my mother would dress up, and they would go someplace. Now, this was not in Boston, but my parents would go someplace nice. It was like date night. And that's what these clubs were for. It was like it was a supper club. You go out for a nice evening out. You would go out for a nice supper. You would dress up. You'd be prepared to spend a bit of money. It was a place to be seen and be seen. A lot of celebrities would go to these places. So it was not, it wasn't like you'd go and pick up somebody and sweat and strobe. It was very elegant.
It's like the dinner and a show and a be seen.
Dinner and a show. Yes,
so
dinner, show, and dancing.
Yeah.
Well,
so were they mostly Middle Easterners, or how soon did a more general public audience come into these places? Do we know?
We don't know exactly, but we definitely know it attracted everybody. But I did want to talk about the fact that it did attract the ethnic places. Like I said, it was a place for the ethnic community to come and to sort of like be together and, you know, hear their own music and dance their dances. We heard about this one, these couple of Greek immigrants, and we have pictures too. And at some point, I'll have to put up the website again. We used to have a website for the documentary, but it was taken down. We heard about these 2 brothers from Greece, and right off the boat, they couldn't speak a word of English. It was Nick and I want to say Tony. But and we have pictures of them doing these crazy line dances at the Averof, with George Abdo egging them on. And the dancer who told us about this said they didn't know a word of English, but they would come. It was a place for them to feel at home. They would be there every week. And actually, we tracked them down. We'd actually tracked down Nick and Tony because we had heard that they had opened up a pizza place in Melrose. And we sent an intern off with some pizza money. And sure, and I think Tony is dead, but Nick is still alive. And has made it, has succeeded and made it big heroes. But anyway, so yes, it definitely Americans would go, but it was definitely a meeting place for the ethnic community.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned George Abdo. So tell me more about the musicians who were playing in this time period.
Oh, the musicians. George Abdo was actually a little bit later. I'd like to give a shout out to Artie Barsamian. He was huge. If you're into swing dance at all, Artie had a big swing orchestra, but it also played Middle Eastern music. In fact, Artie just died this past year, unfortunately, and another person I never got to talk to. Yes, he was in Florida. He passed. But his orchestra still plays. I mean, it's still in his name, Artie Barsamian. He produced one of the most iconic albums of the era. I mean, he had many Middle Eastern music albums, but there was the iconic album called The Seventh Veil. And the dancer on that cover is Feyruz, and some local people might know as Laurie Cabot, the Witch of Salem, official Witch of Salem. Yes, she was a belly dancer. And it's because of Artie, by the way, that you may have heard of a song called Hedy Lou.
Yeah.
That's because it's actually, if dancers who are more familiar with Arabic music, Artie couldn't pronounce Ma Ali Wialti Lou. So he called it Hedy Lou, and that's how we know it as Hedy Lou. So we have him to thank for that. You also have Mike Sarkeesian, who is George Abdo's contemporary, but maybe not as well known. Mike, just like George, trained a lot of dancers and musicians, and he was a consummate showman. He also had an iconic album, known more, unfortunately, for its cover than the music. It has an excellent version of Arapina on it, one of my favorites. But it's Armenian Fun Time. And it shows Mike, like a cartoon Mike, sitting with his head like a photo head plastered on it, in one of those like bohemian fan chairs with all these dancers around him. So. Now, you mentioned the style, the vintage cabaret. We're also working on tracking down a rumor that we have Mike Sarkeesian to thank for that, the 5-part routine.
Do tell.
Yes. Mike, like George traveled. They had shows they took on the road. And what I had heard was that Mike developed the 5-part routine for his Las Vegas act. And if you think about it, it's probably to put like a lot of what a Middle Eastern dance in context for a Western audience. Yes, we have veil. Yes, we have floor work. But this is his way of like formalizing it and putting it into a pattern and then producing it for American audiences. So yes, we're working on it. You don't quote me on that, but we're working on tracking that rumor down, and that would make sense because really in the rest of the world they don't have routines, right?
That's interesting because I had heard an account that the Egyptian routine prior to World War II had some overlap with that 5-part style, like that. A lot of the fast, slow, fast stuff was the same, but the pieces of it were very different. Obviously, they didn't do the slow lyrical veil stuff, and they weren't doing much floor work at that point. But I don't have anything firm on that, just
right.
1 or 2 accounts. So that would make a lot of sense, taking something that exists and adapting to the taste of your audience, which is how entertainment works.
Right, and again, making it accessible to them. Right, because don't forget, belly dance was very exotic back in the day, right? And think of all those albums like How to Dance for Your Husband or How to Make Your Husband a Sultan, right? So it really helped audiences to really kind of appreciate it as an art form.
Similarly, Italian food was considered really exotic at this point, so.
That's true. It would be interesting to, I just have another research. I'm making a note to myself. It'd be interesting to see the menus from those clubs.
Yeah.
Like, do they serve hummus? Exactly. Now, George Abdo, of course, hopefully everyone knows who George is, and we also have him, can credit him with really making Middle Eastern music accessible to Western ears. George removed the quarter tones from the music, and that's what makes.
Really?
Yep. That's what makes his music sense. Yeah. Well, if you think you know the songs, you're familiar with them. But if you listen to the music, there's something I don't know Western about it. You know what I mean? If you compared to saying a recording from Egypt or Lebanon, right?
I'm gonna have to go back and listen.
Yeah. But again, so and he could really. I think that's one of the things that made him so popular. I made his music so popular. People could sort of process it a little easier. He was also known, and he was at the Averof every week. He would give little lectures about the instruments and teach line dances. He really tried to involve the audience in the music and the culture and help them understand what they were seeing. And then last but not least, certainly, is Fred Elias, who is a treasure and a legend, and is still with us at 93 and playing every week at the Athenian Corner. But Freddie is Juilliard trained, but he has played with the greats like Eddie Kochak and Mike Sarkeesian, and has produced many albums of his own, and still producing CDs. So, and we have many musicians here too that, we have such fabulous music here. But many of the musicians that are still playing out were, I call them, George Abdo's band was called the Flames of Araby, right? Which is kind of fun because most of them were Greek or Armenian, not Arabic at all. But many of the Flames are still playing out. You've got Ed Malikian and Yanni Mataris and George Stringos, Leon Manugian. That you can find them out playing around the Boston area.
Mm-hmm. Now, another musician that I think of from the early albums, but not necessarily from the early performance days, is John Barbarian. Is he from a later generation? Or? No,
and thank you for mentioning him. How could I forget him? John rocks, and he's one of my favorites, personal favorites. He is, they don't call him Udi. I'm familiar with the Turkish tradition of naming maestros after their instruments. So you'll hear like musicians named Udi Hrant. He's very famous. Joe Kumjan. The Kumjan brothers are very well known here. But Joe Kumjan's an Udis. They call him Udi Kumjan. And John Barbarian, if he doesn't have that title, should be an Udi because he's really a phenomenal oud player. And he produced several albums, including, there was the one, the cover with the dancer's abdomen body painted. I can't remember the name of that one, but John Barbarian is still playing. You can go to any
ones a couple years ago.
That's right. I saw you dance to him too. You were great.
I remember a couple years ago, a lot of his stuff was re-released and is available on iTunes, which is really neat. And I haven't yet if there's any historical connection, but a lot of dancers, especially on the coast, might be familiar with John Belzickian. And there's a whole lot of overlap in their repertoire. Mm-hmm. But there's a really distinct jump in style. So I'm kind of wondering, wondering if he was listening to John Barbarian at all, or if it just, sprung up independently. So I have no basis for this whatsoever. So nobody listening to this should take this as any kind of historical fact. I'm just really curious.
But they all play together, and I believe John Belzickian's brother is here, so he comes out here a lot. Yeah.
Interesting. So, we've talked a little bit about the music, about the musicians. So, was the music similar to what we're hearing in the clubs and restaurants today, or have there been big changes?
Well, aside from the fact that it wasn't recorded music.
For those of us who are lucky enough to get a live band.
I think it was a little different in that first of all, you had no digitized music, obviously, right? They were all acoustic instruments. And second, you usually had at least 5 musicians, if not more. I know. So now we think ourselves like if we get 2, right? You get Harry Bedrosian on the keyboards and the drummer, right? And we think we're lucky. But back in the day, it wasn't unusual to have 5, 6, 7 musicians. And what it is, they tended to play more as they learned it, right? So they had their repertoire, and they would play as they grew up and learned how to play it. So you probably had it fairly true to how it was originally, how the music originally was, composed. There were no mixes, right? Yeah. You probably also had a lot more Taksim improvisation. I think because you had this great live music, I think you also had a lot of musicians that would have the opportunity to show off each of their instruments. So there would be a lot more like solos and Taksims, things like that.
I'd also guess that since there would be more first and second generation Middle Easterners in the audience, there'd be more people who were expecting it and who would appreciate it. But again, not a fact, just speculation.
And you had to sing, like George sang. George and Mike were both singers. So you had a lot more singing, which was great. And that's what the Middle Eastern community expects. And I hope this doesn't break too many people's hearts, but we're dancers and we love to dance, but that's not what this was about. The dancer was kind of incidental. What these clubs were really about was the music and the singing, and then the community dancing. So it was there was belly dancers, but in the triumvirate, it was music first, then the singer, then the dancer.
Mm-hmm. So I hear there was also a music label in Boston that was recording Middle Eastern music pretty early on. Can you tell me about that?
Yes. There were several key businesses. There was the label you're talking about is Standard Colonial. That was based in Woburn, Mass. And they actually produced. They were a huge producer of international music overall. But I'm sure if those of you who collect LPs, if you look at your label, your liner notes, many of them were produced by Standard Colonial. That was Artie Barsamian's label. Mike was on that. Mike Sarkeesian. Eddie Mekjian, I believe, was on that. But there was a lot of our local music was produced at Standard Colonial. And now I can't find. That's another. In my copious spare time, someone has to go down to the Woburn Town Hall because there is no record of them anymore. They just kind of vanish off the face of the earth. I know. But also, I wanted to mention that we had a very famous Zill foundry here that produced excellent Zills. Eddie Mekjian, a musician, owned it, and he produced Nile. They were called Nile Zills, and I have a pair. They're fabulous. They're very, and they were the Zill to have back in the day. And rumor has it that Mekjian's nephew might be starting it up again. That's something else I had to follow up on. Who, by the way, that nephew happens to be Lenny on Laverne and Shirley. I can't remember the actor's name, but. And then there was also and some dancers of a certain age you might remember. This place just closed last year. Acme TV in Watertown. Acme TV was the place to get Middle Eastern music if you're a belly dancer. They had a catalog, right? And they advertised in all the belly dance magazines, and you used to be able to just send away for all this great music. And sadly... And
it literally was a TV shop. They did TV repair at installations and things like that. They just had this huge wall of belly dance music and Armenian music.
That's right. Yes, and I actually know somebody who managed to procure the inventory, so maybe we can, and I'm hoping to work with her to make that inventory available. I'll keep you posted on that.
Excellent.
Mostly LPs. Sorry.
That's to be expected. And actually, for the record, there's some really good music available out there on LP. If you have any way to convert it to something that you can play more conveniently, that's amazing. My brother-in-law is a really big thrift shopper, and he will pick up anything he finds and convert it for me. It's magic.
Yes,
I get duplicates sometimes, but ooh.
Yes. I have one of those turntables, and they work beautifully, and they're like $100. So if you're a music fiend, what it does is you play it, and then it hooks into your computer, and it digitizes it for you, the music for you. It's great.
Nice. And, we are lucky. A lot of things have been made available as digital downloads, so things on iTunes and eMusic and other sources like that. So there is a lot more available than there used to be. But in a lot of cases, that can only be done when they can find the original copyright holder and procure the rights. And so there's still a lot of things out there that are just floating and ordered because nobody knows who to ask for permission. So vinyl still has a whole lot of value.
Exactly. And Radio Bastet has a wonderful selection of vinyl. She puts like playlists together, makes them available as podcasts. So.
And I'll send out a link to that when I send out the show notes because that is a great resource too. Okay, so I understand that around this same time, in this kind of early days of the nightclub scene, is around the same time that Kef also developed. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. That's Kef means dance, and actually it's a cognate term. Like I know it means something in Arabic too, but I refer to Kef as an Armenian tradition. And I was able to ask when he was here last month, Richard Hagopian, who was a very famous Armenian musician, but he's based in California, about the Kef tradition. It actually, in Armenia, they have Kefs too, but it's very different. The Armenian American Kef is a dance party, and in the old days, it used to be like a three-day bash. You'd have a bunch of musicians brought in from all over, and people would come with food. And they would just set up shop, and they would just dance. It was like nonstop dancing, nonstop playing.
And we're talking line dancing here, yeah?
We're talking line dancing, yes. Now, in the old days, they might bring in a belly dancer. No, and you have to understand, too, this is very interesting. That's this is kind of a part of the legacy here of this whole like melting pot. You don't have belly dance in Armenia. There's no belly dancing. But now here, you all of a sudden you might have a belly dancer at a Kef here in America, and you wouldn't see it anywhere else. So I just want to mention. But yeah, so the earliest Kef was I think it started in Detroit, and then there was a very famous one that would be held yearly in Hartford, Connecticut, and there was also one held in the summer in Cape Cod. And the Cape Cod one, I think, would be the 3-day one. But like I said, the musicians would come from all over, and you never knew who was sitting in. It's just something you'd want to stay up for, And they would just play music. And they revived the Hartford. They stopped it for a long time, and then they revived it a few years ago. And I have a sense it was a shadow of its former self, but the music was still great. And I think Richard Hagopian is the main like powerhouse behind the Kef. He's on most of the. There's a lot of famous Kef recordings, by the way. There's Kef Time is one, and I think there's Detroit Kef Time. Do you sense a theme here? But he is kind of the Kef guy. But it's great. If I would check if your local listings or your church listings. They don't call them Kefs, but a lot of times Armenian churches will have dances, they'll call them. But they bring in what I think of as Kef musicians. There's some musicians you only see at these things, like around here, like Leon Janikian, he's a professor at Northeastern, wonderful clarinetist, but he plays the church dances. But they're like mini Kefs, and I swear you get the best music at the church dances in the Kefs. Not so much in the the music's fabulous in the clubs, but I don't know. There's something about when you hear them playing for the church or, just the party. It's just amazing music. And now there's similar kinds of party kinds of things in the other communities as well. In the Lebanese community, you have the Mahajaran, and that's a party, like a church party. And they'll bring in musicians and have line dances and deb keys, right? Same thing.
And I think this is actually something that's really specific to ethnic communities in the U.S. is that, for a lot of people, the church is also a cultural center. And
yes.
So, it's not just here's our religious community. It's here are the other Armenians in town, or here are the other Greeks in town, or here are the other Lebanese folks in the area. And so there's an identity component that's kind of separate from the belief. And so it's a very natural place to get some really kick-ass music.
Exactly. And it's the heart of the community, right? The church. Yeah.
Excellent. And so for those who are wondering, KEF is spelled K-E-F. K as in kite, E as in elephant, F as in Frank. And if I remember, I'll make a note here. I'll also send out a link to some of the KEF time recordings so that people can check those out. Okay, so we've been talking music for a little bit. Let's move on to the dancers. So who are some of the iconic dancers from the early days in Boston?
Well, I mentioned Fayrouz, now known as Laurie Cabot. There's a dancer who I'm trying to track down because all the musicians talk about her. And when the musicians talk about a dancer, you know she must have been fabulous. She went by her regular name, Gloria. But they all just lift their eyes to heaven when you hear talk about Gloria. And that would have been very early. That would have been in the 50s. Morocco. There was a dancer named Adriana.
That wasn't Aunt Rocky.
Right. It wasn't Aunt Rocky. It's our Morocco. And she predates Aunt Rocky. There was a dancer named Adriana who grew up here. She's based now in Washington. And she has a website, and I gave that to Nadira. She is a very interesting woman. She actually trained Bobby Farah, Ibrahim Farah. And then if you don't know him, he was a very famous choreographer, and actually he really was instrumental in putting Middle Eastern dance in a theatrical setting. But he was based in New York. But he was trained by this Adriana, and she was a phenomenal dancer. Phenomenal dancers, and the musicians still talk about her too. But she, like I said, she left Boston. There was a tragic family thing. Actually, her husband was killed. And she moved to Washington. So we claim her, but Washington claim her too. There was Juliana. Now Juliana is the wasp-waisted beauty on the cover of 3 of the George Abdo albums. And she's still alive, and she's in Florida, and I believe she's still dancing and teaching. There was a dancer who I hear, I know this is a dancer I hear other dancers talk about. They say she was a fabulous dancer, but her name was Crazy, well, they called her Crazy Kismet. Now, with a name like Crazy Kismet, I really wanted to find out what was going on there.
Especially who dancers call crazy.
Exactly. I know. There was Shazar, and we interviewed her extensively for our sampler, and I'll try to make that available to you too. That used to be on Google. That used to be available on Google Video, but Google Video went away, so I'll have to repost the sampler somewhere, and I'll send you a link to Nadira. But Shazar was kind of handpicked by George Abdo, and that's what he would do. He would handpick the dancers who would perform with him at the Avaroff, and so lovely, lovely dancer, and lovely woman, and she worked with him for a number of years. There was Vina, and then she was on, that's George Abdo's sister, and she was on a couple of the covers as well, and sadly she's passed away. We still have
a book or a booklet with one of the albums?
Yes, she did. She did. Absolutely. It was How to Belly Dance, right? In like 10 easy lessons. There was, and we had some great male dancers too. There was Kasim, who is still alive, but Kasim was known for he partnered with many dancers at the time. Jamila Omar, Cassandra, and he was a fabulous dancer, just fabulous. And he was a big producer of dance events. He produced, in fact, he was kind of like sort of started the whole producing big event things and bringing in people for workshops. But he produced a George Abdo event like for New Year's Eve with, get this, over 1,000 people.
Wow.
I know. And then like in later years we had Adana, Adonna, who is still alive, and she started the Odalisque Bellygram Company. And she kind of started almost like a school for belly dancers. Before that, there wasn't a lot of formal belly dance classes. You might have had somebody teaching at the Y. Many ethnic women taught belly dance, but that was usually in people's homes. But Adana started teaching because she wanted the girls she sent out to be very well trained. And so she that's like the first kind of lineage in terms of a class. And so many of the dancers that I trained with, like either were at least had a class with her, if not trained with her. Including a very well-known dancer named Sudana, whose hips adorn Belly Dance Sewing website. She was a phenomenal dancer, and she actually inherited Odalisque and really ran it for a number of years.
Very cool. So, do we know how any of these people got started in the dance? Because there weren't really many classes. So, how did they get into this?
Well, Shazar tells me that she read an article in a newspaper and thought it might be interesting to do, and that's how she got started. Lori Cabot told me that she was always a dancer, but one night she was walking by a club and heard the music and walked in and saw belly dance and started. Well, she said she started belly dancing. Now, I don't know if she started something with that dancer or what, but she just got hired. Some people, of course, learn it because they're ethnic, right? But a lot of times it was like word of mouth, or they saw a dancer and then would ask for lessons or read about it. Like I said, like the Y was usually the place that sometimes people would offer classes. But it wasn't something like today where you'd have belly dance superstars touring. It was something that was you kind of had to work a little bit to find it.
So, the early dancers, were most of them Middle Easterners or Americans or a mix? I know that today, there's this kind of tremendous stigma against performing in public, and so most Middle Eastern dancers are not Middle Eastern. Do we have any sense of where the early dancers were from?
I think, our Morocco was Lebanese. Is Lebanese, sorry. But the other dancers that I have, like legends, I'm doing air quotes here, are mostly American. Mm-hmm. And not to say that some of them didn't have a Middle Eastern background. Like Shazar, I believe, is part either Syrian or Egyptian. I can't remember which. And you can see in her picture, she's beautiful, and she's got that like doe-eyed look. She's very ethnic looking. And of course, George Abdo was Lebanese, so his sister would be Lebanese, right? So, but the majority of them, I believe, were Americans.
And so, how did those dancers' shows compare to what we do now? What's the same and what's different that you know of? Obviously, we don't have video footage.
I know, and like I wasn't there, but of course, live music. Not to go without saying, they were long. It was not unheard of to do a 40-minute show. Yes, with 2 drum solos. It wasn't just like get on and get off. It was you had a big show. Now, one dancer from the time told me, and she's not from here, but this is kind of interesting too, and I want to see if that happened here in Boston. She was from Chicago, actually, but she would dance for the live band, but she always had the same show. The first time she danced, the band gave her a tape and said, "That's your show." I'm like,
really?
Oh. I know. Is that weird? So I wanted to know if that happened here. But it's still a long show, is what I would say. But they were very long. And like I said, you were expected to do at least 2 drum solos. You were expected to play zills. Odds are you would not be hired if you couldn't play zills. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You were expected to. You were there for the whole evening. Usually, you were expected to show up in evening attire. You would interact with customers. Now they might buy you a drink, but you were not expected to drink it. You would be polite, have a sip, or if you were not sitting with the customers, you would sit in with the band and play zills or Rick. But it wasn't like dashing in jeans, doing your show and leaving. You were there for the evening, and that's how I learned like a lot of my line dancing. My first teacher, Nahareen, kind of trained us that way. We'd go see her dance, and we'd get dressed up. Like when I started belly dancing, my evening attire like tripled. And Nahareen we were there for the evening, and she would always get up and she would line dance. Belly dancers are expected to line dance and dance with the customers. And yeah, it was a whole night, and you were paid.
Okay. So, I know your research is focused on the Boston area, but do you know of any other areas that were early hotbeds, belly dance, and Middle Eastern entertainment for the most part?
Yeah, New York, of course, 8th Avenue. That's another place I would love to have been, fly on the wall at least. In fact, there's even an album called 8th Avenue, Armenian 8th Avenue. But San Francisco was as well. You had Jamila Selampur out there, and her troupe Balanat, which was a seminal troupe. You had Masha Archer was in that troupe, and she was Carolina Noricio's teacher. Right. Ria of Greece was in Balanat, and she's credited with being the first belly dancer to wield a sword in a nightclub. And Ria of Greece has a connection back here because her daughters, of course, Piper and Melina. Melina's here in Boston, and Piper's in Maryland. So yeah, San Francisco, I think, had a really had a pivotal, a seminal belly dance scene. And as a matter of fact, that's one approach we're thinking of in the documentary, is kind of comparing and contrasting what's happening in Boston versus what was happening in California.
I'd love to hear that. So, do you know how much crossover there was between these early hotbeds, or if they mostly evolved in isolation from each other?
There was a lot of crossover between New York and Boston. I mean, it was, musicians would go back and forth all the time and play. In fact, Jamila Omar, who was really based in New York, was married to a drummer from around here, Ronnie Kirby. But Bobby Farah and Elena Lentini would come up and perform at the Middle East. So yeah, there was a lot of crossover there. Probably San Francisco is probably a little more isolated, but that's geography as well.
For those of you who don't know, Boston to New York is about a 5-hour drive these days. So even with older roads, it still wouldn't have been an unreasonable day trip.
But
excellent
travel they did, which is awesome.
Well, also, at a time when the performers would be really in demand, and dancers and musicians weren't a dime a dozen. It would be worth your while to hire somebody to come over. So is there anything else you want to tell us about the early days?
Wow. Yes, another thing I did. Well, I just want to mention, too, that we also had the phenomenon here in Boston of the dancer run venue. There was a very famous, to us, in the late 70s, early 80s, Club Cairo, and it was a dancers cooperative. It was in Central Square, the old Joy of Movement, which is now the Dance Complex, and it was run by dancers. And it was to provide newer dancers a place to learn live music, to dance live music, as well as have like a star dancer. Dancers were paid. The band was paid. But it was all run by dancers, and like one week you might be a star dancer, and the next week you'd be setting up chairs. It was really a cooperative, but it was one of the earliest run dancer venues, and it'd be great to have that back again.
Yeah, this is the first thing I was thinking is ooh. So if there's one thing you'd like listeners to take away from all this, what do you think that would be? I want to give some thought. Actually, I have two things. Can I say two things? You can say two things.
Okay. First is that you don't have to go back to Egypt to get a sense of history for this dance. We don't really know where belly dance comes from. Not really. But we do know a lot about its history here in this country, and that's something that's in our reach, And I think we should acknowledge and honor our foremothers here. They may not be as famous as Samia Gamal or Tahia Karaoke, but it's thanks to them that you're even studying and performing this dance today. And then second, it's the musical legacy. it breaks my heart when dancers choose to perform to a CD when there's live music available. And while I really do like music like Beats Antique and some of the music that, like maybe some of the new fusion dancers dance with, their tribal dancers dance, I do wish that if you're studying this art form that you familiarize yourself with our repertoire, the original repertoire, because it's just so rich and there's so much to offer, and you can still hear it here performed live by the people you heard playing on the records, and we're going to lose them soon. And so, especially if you're within, in New York or Boston, get out and support your live music venues, because they're not going to be around much longer. And it would be a real shame to see them go away entirely.
Yeah, wouldn't have been able to pick from those two either. So this has been really fascinating, but obviously there's a whole lot more out there. So if people want to learn more about all of this, what would you recommend?
Well, wow. Where to start? I did give you a couple of links. Adriana, I gave a link to Adriana's site only because she's got some really good pictures. I gave you a link, too, to an interesting site. Leon Janikian is starting an archive of Armenian music, and he has actual recordings, live recordings from Club Zahra. Some incredible music. I didn't even mention Marco Melkon or Udi Hrant, but those are very famous musicians that actually were here in Boston. They're Armenian musicians that were here for a while. Talk to your teachers. Read the liner notes. Liner notes are provide wealth of information. Pick up belly dance LPs or listen to Radio Bastet. Educate yourself on the music, I would say. It's kind of like, someday hopefully there'll be a book or a documentary. But in the meantime, I would just say noodle around, listen to the music. I'm happy, if you give my email address, I'm happy to point people in the right direction if I can. There is a book, too. It's not a book about really the history of belly dance in Boston, but they do reference the club scene. There's a chapter on the club scene, and that's a link I gave to Nadira for the show notes as well.
Okay, I'll include all of these when I send out the recording.
Yeah.
And obviously, if people want to hear about more from you specifically, Belly Dance New England Magazine would be one place to do that. And I'll send that out, too.
Thank you.
Hey. So I think I'm going to open it up to questions now. So if there's anybody who's listening on the webcast, there is a nice little box at the left-hand side of your screen that you can use to type in questions. And if you're listening on phone or Skype, you can press *2 to raise your hand so I can unmute you individually. The only thing you need to know is that if you're on Skype, that you need to press that on the Skype dial pad, not *2 on your keyboard. Okay, so if you have any questions, now's a great time to ask. That's my cat jumping off the table and trying to knock things down. Okay, we've got a question from Sarah. Sarah says, "Hi, Nadira. I do historical and genealogical research as a hobby, and I'd love to help out with some of Amy's research if you'd like to pass along my details to her." And Sarah, I'll do that, but I'm not going to read your email out to everybody here. But I'll pass that on to Amy. So let me just write down that before I lose it.
Sarah, thank you so much. Yes, I look forward to corresponding with you.
Okay.
And that's maybe another thing I could put out while you're waiting for a few more questions. Part of the, my friend Deanna and I have been working on this documentary, or trying to get it off the ground for a few years. As you know, arts funding is less than optimal. Any ideas your listeners may have on funding or ideas for funding would be great. We're trying to do grants. We thought about a Kickstarter. The problem is the amount of money that we need. We would like to do PBS quality documentary. So that's like $250,000 to do it right. Anyway, so I just thought I'd put that out there.
I'm going to go out and buy a lottery ticket, and if I win, you can have it.
Oh, bless you.
Okay, so again, we're still open for questions. So anybody who's listening on the phone or on Skype can press 2. Anybody on the webcast can type in your question on the left in that little box. It's late on a Monday night, so we're not getting so many questions. All right, so I'm going to ask a different question. You can obviously still ask questions. You can raise your hand or type in. But I'd also like to ask everybody who's listening in, what was the most important or interesting thing that you learned on this call? So again, you can press *2 if you're on the phone, *2 on your Skype keypad, or type it in at the box to the left.
This will be interesting.
This is always interesting. I learned this from somebody else who gave marketing teleseminars, and every time somebody would say what they learned, it would pick up one little thing that I had heard but not really made with of, and I'd go, ooh. So don't be shy. The first one to chime in gets a virtual prize. Not a real prize, but eternal bragging rights. My personal favorite was the Star of Cairo Cooperative. I hadn't heard about that, but I think it's a fabulous idea, especially with the live music.
Yes. Oh, Club Cairo. Club Cairo. Yes.
Oh, sorry, Club Cairo.
Yeah. Yeah, it's getting the musicians to work for what they paid them then. That would be.
Well, that's the thing is that when I was in this kind of newbie dancer in this kind of like intermediate student space, there were actually still some dance organized clubs that actually had live music at the time, and so I got to kind of cut my teeth before I had to get up and do a full-length show. Even at the student nights, it's still kind of a bigger deal when you're at a restaurant in front of the general public than with an audience of other dancers, so that matters. Okay,
Yeah.
we've got a question on the webcast here. Anthea in Fredericksburg, who I think is Kawaki, says, how about Zabeth? Is she still dancing?
Sabath isn't. How could I forget Sabath? Sabath came, Beth was on, she sang and played zills on one of the George Abdo albums. She was a George Abdo dancer, and she was partnered with Kasim. So yes, Sabath is still out there. She's producing events. She does a great, I don't know, it's a part of our Christmas tradition, is a fundraiser for the Home for Little Wanderers here every Christmas. No, but she's still out there, which is awesome because she really is a legend, and she knows how to put on a show. And whenever you watch Beth perform, you get a kind of a taste of how it must have been like then.
Now, do you know what era she started in? I'm not sure if she started in the 60s or the 70s.
She started in I'd be at the late 60s, but she was a go-go dancer first.
So she probably had a lot of the showmanship experience from her previous dance history.
Exactly, but
and that's one of the things that if you see her.
Pardon?
I said, that's the things that if you see her, one of the big things that you come away with is showmanship.
Exactly.
It's way more than the moves or the zills. It's the kind of put it all together into a performance with a capital P.
Exactly. And, of course, Beth is also known for her zill work. I mean, she really plays the zills like a musician, which, you don't see much of. I mean, they're very good zill players, but it's like, I don't know. And I believe she has a DVD out about zill playing, but she's a maestro when it comes to the zills.
Okay. Looks like we've got another question on the webcast. In the meantime, if there's anybody who's listening on the phone or on Skype, press star and raise your hand. We've got a question from Aaron who says, in the very beginning, was it primarily the musicians that trained the dancers, or the dancers take trips to Egypt for additional training?
Back then, there wasn't much training going on in Egypt. In fact, a lot of the dancers in Egypt learned how to teach here. No, the musicians would train dancers in terms of probably more critique. I mean, like George Abdo didn't dance, but they would like train them in musicality, right? What to expect during parts of the routine, probably zills. They probably learned most of their dancing from other dancers. It was but to Nadira's point, the musicians like George and Mike would put like the showmanship patina and ready them for like club performances. that make sense?
Absolutely. And the other thing I'd add to that is that at that point air travel was like insanely expensive, and traveling on a boat would take a really long time. So a lot of people just weren't doing that kind of traveling anyway.
And I don't think there was a perception of Egypt or Turkey as a origin for this. Not that they didn't know it intellectually, but again, there was so much here going on. And again, the mix of music that you would hear in the clubs was an amalgam not only of Armenian and Turkish and Greek, but Arabic. But there was no sense of I must go see Samia Gamal or whatever, because there wasn't the internet, right? And there were a few magazines at the time, but not a lot. And there wasn't as much information readily available to you. So the idea of going to Egypt to study, I don't think was really something that most dancers aspired to.
Mm-hmm. And I heard, and again, I don't know if this is true, so this is hearsay and speculation, that dancers didn't necessarily think about Egypt as kind of the cultural center of belly dance until the 80s when we started getting VHS tapes and actually being able to see what was going on over there. And until then, a lot of what we had was what was being passed down in the clubs. So, but again, speculation, not fact. All right, it looks like we've got a hand raised, so I am going to go ahead and unmute Claudia. Let me go ahead and do that now. Hi, Claudia. I can't hear you very clearly at all. Okay, Claudia, I'm sorry, but we're not able to hear you very well. Our message is getting garbled. So what I would say is that if you'd like to log into the webcast and give us your message typed in, that would be awesome. Let me just get you the address. Okay, that is instantteleseminar.com/event ID equals 354-212-76. So you can try logging in there and typing in your question. I'm so sorry about that.
It dropped me.
Are you still there, Amy?
It dropped me. Yes, we had a little bit of a flicker here.
I'm sorry. Well, no, it was missed anything because. What's that?
No, we just had a little bit of a flicker here. I think we're having a little bit of weather here.
Okay. Well, you haven't missed anything because unfortunately we couldn't hear Claudia clearly on the line, so I have to type in her question on the webcast. Hopefully she can get in there. But in the meantime, I'm going to unmute a caller from Hartford, Connecticut.
Hi, Nadira, and it's Sahina from Western Mass.
Oh, that's right. Your cell phone always shows up as Connecticut.
I know. Eventually, I'll change it. Hey, guys. I was wondering. So there were dancers that were handpicked by some of the musicians, and dancers always played zills. But were who were who ended up joining in with a band and becoming a band member, because of their zill playing or anything like that.
Oh, interesting. So like an active musician?
Yeah, like a dancer who ended up becoming a formal member of a band.
That's a really good question. I don't know of any. I do know, but there were several dancers, as I mentioned Zabeth, but there was another dancer, Amber, that they were often picked to play on LPs and play zills.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know of any that eventually became musicians. I like that question.
I know a lot of teachers have learned to drum, but I don't know if any of them ever played in bands.
Yeah. That's a really good question, though. I'll have to go back and look at that as a line of inquiry.
Yeah, I'd love to know.
Okay, thank you. Now, was there anything else you wanted to say while you're on the line?
Could you maybe along the same lines, if you could name any that did end up playing on LPs?
Well, there was certainly there was Zabeth, like I said. There was Amber.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's see, who else? Well, Phaedra. This is a little later, like in the 80s, but Phaedra of Boston has played zills. She played on a Mal Barsamian album. Phaedra's Mystical Veil. That one.
I love that album.
I know, and I think it's reissued. It was out of print for a while. Let's see, who else? Amber, Zabeth. I want to say Zabida. I think she played on. It was funny. There were dancers that were associated more with Mike Sarkeesian, and then there were dancers that were more associated with George. You know, I don't want to call them factions because it's not like they were at odds with each other. But that's just how I think about them. You know, like almost like minions. Yeah. So and Zabida was. She still teaches, and she's here in Haverhill. And she was like a Mike Sarkeesian dancer, and she's also a very accomplished still player, and I believe she might have played on an album or two as well. So.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Zahina. Okay, I'm going to head over to the webcast questions. We've got a comment from Tonica who says, I wasn't aware that there's such a rich history and impact to how belly dance has evolved here in the U.S. Thanks for sharing this, Amy.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Monica.
Yeah.
Claudia got onto the webcast, so I'm glad you did that. She asks, how did the nightclub shows in Boston and New York compare to the nightclub performances in Egypt?
Oh, well, I have to. I don't know. I didn't go to Egypt at the time, but I do know. One of my teachers, Katya, studied with Bobby Farah. And she started going over to Egypt probably in the 80s. So it's not really, we can't speak to the 50s, 60s, or 70s. But she would, and they would allow her to video. And so she has this fabulous footage. So if you're in the Boston area, if you haven't studied with Katya, I just want to put in a plug for that because and you're just talking to her is fabulous. But so she video. She saw people like Sorazaki and Nagwa Fawad and I'll see who else. My name blanking for a minute, but again, these were like epic shows. I mean, the dancer was on for a long time, probably longer than here. Nagwa Fawad had pips. I call them pips. Backup dancers. And guess who was one of her dancers? Yusri Sharif. Yes. And she always had these amazing entrances. They were all not only they were about the show as a dance, but they're about showmanship with special effects. One time she came in on a train. This is Nagwa Fawad. So yeah, I would just say those shows sounded like they were just totally epic. and probably not as you think of as a traditional show. But and they had orchestras, and they were Zill players. I mean, and the Zagat players in the orchestra, they played stage Zagats, right, which were the size of dinner plates. And the dancers would usually hire their own orchestras, which is kind of cool. And they usually had singers too. If you're familiar with Fatma Sirhan, who I love, she's awesome. She would be part of the show. The singer would be part of the show as well. So the dancer would have this whole epic evening, right, with special effects and backup dancers and a singer, and they just sounded amazing.
I'd like to actually touch on something that you said earlier in the call, and that's that, also in the U.S., it was really common to dance to, in the same set, music from lots of different countries. Whereas I imagine in Egypt you'd get mostly Egyptian and at least mostly Arabic music. So what you were dancing to would probably be different too.
Yes. Well, there's songs in our repertoire that kind of that transcend association with a culture, right? Aziza is a great example. It's really an Arabic song, but and actually that's the name of our working name of our documentary, because it was a song that every musician had to know how to play, and every dancer knew how to dance to. In fact, and there's and I'll try to surface this on my website. I have a columnist who writes music columns for me occasionally. This is the person I referred to at the beginning of the podcast who really knows the history here. And she wrote an article about these songs that kind of transcend ethnicity. Layla, right? George Abdo played it, right? That was a big George Abdo song. But, you know, an Armenian band will give you that. They know how to play it. So you'd get songs like that in your routine. Your ending would almost always be a Krush Lama, regardless of what they started with, you know, because that was the tradition. You know, you do Shifteli, that's kind of like, that's a Turkish rhythm. But you might get like a slow Arabic song for your veil, or a Greek song. My Black Eyes is pretty popular, right? So yeah, it was like a melting pot in music too.
And actually, that was a crossover song too. My Black Eyes is why am I blanking on the name of it? Where Did Our Love Begin? Big Feiruz. Tamamatsiyasu and I can't believe I can't think of the name of this song. But also one of those crossover Arabic to Greek songs too. So.
Mizerlu? No, not Mizerlu. That was Greek.
No. Oh yeah, that was very popular. That was one of those like took off like fire all over the Middle East.
I know, it was the Habibi Aini of its time.
Excellent. So it looks like we have another call, another question from Sahina. I'm going to unmute you now. Hi there.
Hi again. So this is actually along the lines of what you were just discussing. So Amy, you'd mentioned earlier about the routines, how they used to be a lot longer, more like 40 minutes, and you had said that there were sometimes 2 drum solos. I was wondering if there were other ways that the structure of the routines were different, like were there other parts of the routine that had 2 pieces, like 2 talk scenes or something, or were the songs themselves just played in longer versions?
I think it was more of the latter, but I think there was also opportunity for like a prop. So you might have, you know, so instead of having to, you know, these days it's like you barely get your cane out when you have to put it away again. You know, you had some time to explore that and make a show of it, or a sword, right? Especially for you had floor work, which you don't have these days.
Right.
And if you do, again, I mean, you might, I don't know about you guys, but I always feel a little bit rushed, right? But, you know, back in the day, you probably had a lot longer, again, to explore and draw that out and make it really, you know, something. But I think I think you also had a lot of tuxedos, like I said earlier. I think, you know, the band got to show off a little bit, and you would have like solo instrumentals that you could dance to as well. And again, I wasn't there. This is all like what dancers have told us what they dance to. So.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Sahina. Okay, and actually I looked up the name of that song. It was Nibtinayin El Hikaya. So that's the one that's been translated into Greek as Tamavra Matyasu, Your Black Eyes.
Oh, cool.
All right, so does anybody else have any questions? If you're on the phone or press *2. If you're on the webcast, go ahead and type them in on the box at left. Not seeing anything, but we're going to give people another minute. I do have 13 minutes before my teleconference service here is going to cut us off. So if you do have anything, don't be shy.
They're all off checking Radio Bestat.
Probably. But again, I will send out that link when I send out the recording, so you don't need to worry about Googling any of that. Okay, I think that's it for questions, so let's call it a night. So thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you. This is great fun. I love talking about this, as you know.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody else, for coming. So this is our call, but the conversation isn't over. We've got a private Facebook group just for the Clubhouse folks. So if you're not already in there, you'll find a link in the email when I send out the call recording. and I'll also send out that email shortly. There is going to be an approval delay if you're not already a member. I just have to manually approve everybody who comes in, so don't worry if you can't post right away. And in that email, I'll also send out a link to the call recording and to some of the links that Amy has mentioned or sent me privately. And I'm also going to ask for your feedback on the class. As I mentioned, this whole idea was a spin-off of a question by Pamela Rosengren, and I would love to answer your questions or interview the folks that you'd like to hear from. So I'll be asking you about topics, speakers, and anything that I can do to improve the call and make these Clubhouse calls what you want. Our next call is going to be on Tuesday, January 8th at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. And my guest is going to be Zahra of San Francisco, who is the publisher of Rocks TV. Now, we've been arranging this on a little bit short notice, so I don't have the topic just yet, but you're going to be really glad you heard from her because she's got something really cool going on. So other than that, the only thing that I have to add is that the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse is the come on in and join us kind of clubhouse, not the no boys allowed kind. So if you know anybody who would like this, go ahead and send them to bellydancegeek.com/clubhouse, and they can come and join us for these calls too. This call with Amy will be available until the next call goes on January 8th, so there's plenty of time for them to come and listen to all this great geekery that we just enjoyed. So until then, happy dancing. I'm just going to unmute everybody for a sec so we can all say goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for listening. For more geek-tacular resources, visit bellydancegeek.com.